The can of spray under your sink is not just failing against your roach problem. In a real, documented way, it is making it worse. Scattering a colony that was contained in one wall void into 3 or 4 new ones, while the roaches most likely to survive that spray are, more and more often in this country, the exact ones genetically built to shrug it off entirely. I want to explain both halves of that claim properly because they're the reason licensed exterminators almost never reach for a spray can as their actual tool. Whatever a can of store-bought roach killer might suggest about how professionals handle this. What they use instead is a slow, patient bait, and I'm going to walk you through exactly why that bait works through the roach's own biology against it. The specific reason a growing number of roach populations have started ignoring the most common bait ingredient sold for decades. How to build and place bait so it actually reaches a hiding colony rather than sitting untouched. An old mineral compound that still outperforms most modern products for a fraction of the cost. And the handful of habits that keep roaches from finding a reason to stay once you've cleared them out. This is going to run a little over 20 minutes, and every part of it earns that time. Start with what a roach actually does when it senses danger, because it explains everything else in this video. Roaches are highly sensitive to vibration and moving air, detected through fine hairs along their legs and a pair of tail appendages called cerci, sensitive enough to register the pressure wave of an approaching hand or a can being shaken well before you've actually sprayed anything. The instant response to that detection is flight toward the nearest dark, tight space. And if you've ever watched roaches vanish the moment a light comes on, that's the same reflex at work. Spray a roach you can see, and you're very often spraying an animal already mid-escape. And the ones that survive the direct hit because contact sprays require actual contact to work, and a fast-moving target in a lit room is genuinely hard to hit squarely. Carry that fear response straight back to wherever the rest of the colony is sheltering. Roach colonies aren't spread randomly through a house. They cluster tightly in a small number of preferred harborage sites, chosen for warmth, moisture, and tight physical contact on multiple sides of their body at once. A preference entomologists call thigmotropism, essentially wanting to feel surfaces pressing against them from more than one direction, which is exactly why they favor the inside of a wall void or the gap behind a loose baseboard over open floor space. Disturb one of those clustered sites hard enough with a chemical the colony can smell and react to, and a portion of the population doesn't die. It relocates, sometimes splitting across 2 or 3 new harborage sites in other parts of the house, and you've traded one contained, findable colony for several scattered ones. Here's the second half of the problem, and it's the part most people have never heard explained. German cockroaches, the small tan species responsible for the overwhelming majority of home infestations, have been under sustained chemical pressure from consumer insecticides for decades now. And insect populations under that kind of sustained selective pressure do exactly what any population under selective pressure does. The individuals with some natural resistance survive and reproduce, while the susceptible ones don't. And given how fast a German cockroach reproduces, that selection can shift a local population's genetics within a relatively short number of generations. Pyrethroid resistance specifically, pyrethroids being the active ingredient family in most consumer spray products, is now extensively documented in urban German cockroach populations across multiple studies, meaning a spray that would have reliably killed the same species 40 years ago may do measurably less against the actual population living in a given house today. You're not just fighting the wrong tactic. In a growing number of homes, you're fighting an insect that has, at a genetic level, already adapted to the tool you're using against it. A gel bait works through a completely different mechanism, one that turns the roach's own social behavior into the delivery system, and understanding this is what separates someone who places bait effectively from someone who scatters a few dots around and wonders why nothing changed. Roaches are genuinely social insects in a way people don't usually picture when they think of them as a solitary pest. They engage in coprophagy, meaning they eat feces, including their own species' droppings, and this isn't incidental. Roach feces carries aggregation pheromones, chemical signals that communicate this is a good, safe harborage site to other roaches, along with beneficial gut microorganisms passed between individuals this way, which is part of why a droppings-marked crack in a cabinet becomes a magnet for the rest of the colony over time, rather than staying attractive to just the roach that found it first. Roaches also practice necrophagy, meaning they'll consume dead members of their own colony, which sounds unpleasant but matters enormously for how bait actually works. A slow-acting insecticide in a gel bait, typically from a class of compounds that disrupts the insect's nervous system over a period of hours rather than seconds, gives a roach that feeds at the bait station enough time to return to the main harborage site before she dies. Once there, several separate pathways carry the toxin onward through the colony that a fast-killing spray never reaches at all. Other roaches feed on her droppings after she's ingested the bait, picking up a secondary dose. If she dies at or near the harborage site, other roaches feed on her body directly, picking up a further dose through necrophagy. And females carrying an egg case called an ootheca that has already ingested the bait pass some effect onto the eggs before they ever hatch. A single roach finding a bait station, in other words, can end up contributing to the deaths of dozens of others she never directly shared food with, entirely through behaviors that exist independent of anything you did. You're simply positioning the bait so that first roach has a reason to find it. This is precisely why exterminators default to bait rather than spray as their real working tool. It isn't a secret held back from the public out of self-interest. It's simply that gel bait requires patience. Results build over 1 to 3 weeks rather than the visible, immediate kill of a spray. And a product that shows nothing dramatic in the first 10 minutes has never been the easiest thing to market directly to a homeowner standing in a hardware store aisle wanting an immediate answer to what they're looking at on their kitchen floor tonight. Here's a detail that genuinely surprises people, and it's real, published entomological research, not folklore. For a long stretch of the 20th century, glucose was the standard sweetener used to make roach bait attractive, since roaches, like most insects, are drawn strongly to sugar. Researchers began noticing, starting in the 1990s, that certain German cockroach populations were showing markedly reduced response to glucose-based baits specifically, and follow-up studies confirmed a genuine evolutionary shift. In populations under sustained pressure from glucose-sweetened bait, roaches carrying a trait that made glucose taste bitter rather than sweet to them had a survival advantage, since they avoided the poisoned bait that was killing glucose-seeking roaches around them. Enough generations under that pressure, and glucose aversion became a widespread, heritable trait in numerous documented populations. An insect population effectively evolving to taste the exact thing meant to kill it as unpalatable. This is a real, if somewhat narrow, explanation for why an old bait that worked reliably for a household years ago can seem to stop working, even though nothing about how it's being used has changed. The local population may have shifted. It's also exactly why modern bait formulations have increasingly moved toward other attractants less associated with this specific resistance pattern. And it's worth knowing as a homeowner specifically because if a glucose-based bait genuinely isn't producing results after several weeks of correct placement, switching to a different bait formulation, rather than assuming the whole approach has failed, is the more accurate diagnosis. Commercial gel bait, sold in a syringe-style applicator for precise placement, works well and is inexpensive. But the technique matters as much as the product, and this is where most people underperform without realizing it. Placement has to follow where roaches actually travel and shelter, not where it's convenient for you to put something. Small dots, roughly the size of a pea, placed every few feet rather than one large deposit, along the back edges of cabinets, behind and beneath appliances, around plumbing penetrations under sinks, and inside the hinge area of cabinet doors. Wherever you've actually seen roach activity or the telltale dark pepper-like droppings that mark a travel route, gives you far more contact points across the colony's actual territory than a small number of large placements ever will. Avoid placing bait anywhere you've recently used a spray or a surface cleaner, since chemical residue on a surface can make roaches avoid crossing it entirely, defeating the bait sitting right past that treated line. Patience matters more here than with almost anything else on this channel. Visible activity often continues, sometimes even appears to increase slightly, for the first week or two as the bait works its way through the colony via the pathways described earlier and resists the urge to add a spray on top out of impatience, since that reintroduces exactly the scattering problem this whole approach is built to avoid. Expect a real, sustained decline starting somewhere in the second to third week, with most established infestations substantially cleared within 4 to 6 weeks of consistent, correctly placed bait. Before gel bait technology existed in its modern form, boric acid was the standard, and it remains genuinely effective today, worth understanding as both a real historical technique and a still useful modern tool in its own right. Boric acid is chemically related to, but distinct from, the borax I've covered on this channel in the context of ants. Borax is sodium borate, while boric acid is the specific acid form, and it's the acid form that carries the insecticidal properties relevant here. It works through two separate mechanisms at once, which is part of why it's held up so well over such a long stretch of pest control history. Ingested, it disrupts a roach's digestive and metabolic processes in a way that's ultimately lethal, working over a period of hours to a couple of days rather than instantly. And physically, fine boric acid powder abrades the waxy coating on a roach's exoskeleton in much the same way food-grade diatomaceous earth does against other insects, causing fatal dehydration as a secondary mechanism alongside the ingested toxicity. Mixed with a small amount of sugar or a bit of flour to make it more appealing and easier to apply, a thin dusting of boric acid in the same locations described for gel bait, cracks, crevices, behind appliances, along travel routes, works through both the ingestion and contact mechanisms simultaneously. And because it works differently from gel bait's specific insecticide class, it's a genuinely useful alternative or supplement in a household where bait alone hasn't fully resolved an established population, since you're now attacking the problem through two distinct chemical pathways rather than relying on one. Keep application light rather than heavy. A light dusting a roach walks through is more effective than a heavy pile, since heavy application can actually cause roaches to avoid the area rather than track through it. and always place it somewhere out of reach of pets and children given its toxicity if ingested directly in quantity. Everything above handles an active colony. This part is what keeps a new one from establishing once you've cleared it, and it works on the same logic as excluding any pest. Remove the reasons they'd want to be there in the first place. Roaches need 3 things consistently available to sustain a colony: food, water, and the tight, dark harborage sites described earlier, and a kitchen that leaves food residue on counters overnight, a bathroom or kitchen with a consistently damp spot from a slow leak, and an abundance of unsealed cracks and gaps gives them all 3 without requiring any real effort on their part. Wiping down counters and sweeping up crumbs before bed rather than in the morning, fixing even minor consistent leaks promptly, and caulking the gaps around baseboards, cabinet backs, and pipe penetrations that give roaches both entry from outside and harborage once inside meaningfully reduces how attractive a given space is to begin with, independent of whatever active treatment you're running. Cardboard deserves specific mention since it's an underappreciated roach magnet most people never think to address. The corrugated structure of cardboard is exactly the kind of tight, multi-surface contact space roaches are drawn to, and stacks of stored boxes, particularly in a basement or garage, are a genuinely common overlooked harborage site. Switching to plastic storage bins where you can, particularly for anything stored long-term, removes a hiding spot most people never consider a factor at all. If you're dealing with an active problem right now, here's the order I'd work through it in. Set the spray can aside entirely. I know that's the hardest instruction in this video to actually follow when you're looking at a roach on your counter tonight, but every spray you use is working against the bait you're about to place, both through the scattering effect and through any residue that makes roaches avoid crossing treated surfaces. Place gel bait or a light boric acid dusting at the locations described earlier, focused on where you've actually seen activity rather than spread thin across the whole house. Handle the sealing and sanitation work over the following days as time allows, since it compounds with the bait rather than needing to happen first. And then give it real time, 2 to 3 weeks before judging whether it's working, 4 to 6 before expecting the problem substantially resolved, because every part of the mechanism explained in this video depends on that patience being real rather than theoretical. Try this out and tell me in the comments how long it takes for your own numbers to turn around. I'm curious how consistent that 2 to 3 week window holds up across different homes.